Good evening. Arthur Hastings here, welcoming you once more to The Little Grey Cells. Tonight's tale, The Affair of the Velvet Letter, another Hercule Poirot mystery that will test the very limits of logic and reason. Before we begin, I must convey Poirot's own appreciation, and mine, to our extraordinary audience spanning continents and time zones. New listeners, we would be most honored if you'd subscribe and share with us your location in the comments below. Now then, settle into your chair, brew a proper tisane as the great detective would insist, and join me in unraveling this most curious affair. Your grey cells are about to be put to work. Chapter 1. The House at the Edge of the Water. "The train," said Dr. Leonard Harbury, as the motor car rounded the final bend of the drive, "is never late at Velmont. Only the guests arrive early, and usually by accident." Hercule Poirot said nothing. He was occupied with the view. The house presented itself without apology. It was large without being grand, old without being picturesque, and set so close to the lake that, on certain mornings, one might be forgiven for imagining it had simply grown there, like a dark species of fungus nourished by the water. Tall beeches enclosed it on three sides, their leaves having turned the colour of old copper and dark honey. Beneath them, the shadows moved. The afternoon light lay thin and grey across the grounds, the quality of light one associates with the last days of autumn, neither kind nor cruel, but merely indifferent. It was, Poirot reflected, the sort of house that remembered things. He emerged from the motor car with care, ensuring that the polish on his shoes survived the encounter with the gravel drive. Harbury, a large and amiable man with the hearty manner of one accustomed to soothing agitated patients, was already at the door. He gestured broadly at the facade. "Well, what do you make of it?" "I make of it," said Poirot, "that the east wing guttering requires attention, that the upstairs shutters on the right have not been opened in some considerable time, and that someone has recently removed a climbing plant from the main wall. You may observe the marks where it was trained." He tilted his egg-shaped head. "Whether any of this is of significance, I cannot yet say." Harbury laughed. "You have not changed, my friend. Come inside. Helena is expecting us." The hall of Velmont House smelled of wax polish and old paper, with a note beneath both of something floral and faintly damp. As though the lake itself had been admitted at some earlier hour and not entirely persuaded to leave. The floor was flagstone, covered by a turkey rug of considerable age. Portraits lined the wall of the staircase, men and women of a certain era, regarding the present with the serene detachment of those who have heard all the news and found it wanting. Poirot paused at the base of the stair. One of the portraits had been moved recently. He could see it plainly. The rectangle of darker wallpaper behind the frame, where the paper had been protected from years of lamp smoke and atmospheric dulling. The portrait now hanging there was of a young woman in a green gown. The portrait that had hung there before, whatever it had been, was gone. He filed the observation away in that precise interior cabinet that was his mind, and followed Harbury into the drawing-room. Lady Helena Velmont received her guests standing at the fireplace, which was itself an act of considerable physical will, for she was a woman of 63, and the chill of the season was evident in the careful way she held herself. She was tall, still handsome, with silver hair dressed in the manner of a generation past, and eyes of a peculiar pale grey that put one in mind, immediately and unavoidably, of the lake visible through the long windows behind her. She had written 14 novels. Poirot had read 4 of them. They were, he considered, very good indeed, particularly in the matter of motive. Helena Valmont understood why people did terrible things, which was, he had often observed, rarer than the ability to describe what they had done. Monsieur Poirot. She offered her hand. Her grip was firm. I am glad Leonard persuaded you. I confess I did not expect success. You underestimate Dr. Harbury's powers of persuasion, madame, and perhaps overestimate my resistance to an interesting problem. Poirot smiled. Though I am told the problem is merely theoretical. Something shifted in Lady Helena's expression, too small and too brief to name. Quite theoretical, she said. Do come and meet the others. The others were 4 in number, arranged about the drawing room with the slightly artificial disposition of people who had been waiting for a distraction and were glad one had arrived. Richard Valmont, Lady Helena's nephew, was the first to come forward. He was perhaps 35, with the fair good looks of a man, accustomed to being found attractive, and the faint restlessness of one who had never been given quite enough to do. His handshake was vigorous. His smile was wider than it needed to be. Poirot noticed that his left hand, which he did not extend, was closed into a loose fist at his side. Extraordinary to meet you, Richard said. Aunt Helena has always said you're the finest detective in England. In Europe, said Poirot pleasantly. But I am not here as a detective. I am here to discuss the psychology of anonymous letters, a theoretical matter. Quite, said Richard. And his fist, for just a moment, tightened. Clara Fenton, Lady Helena's secretary, was a small, neat woman of 40 with an air of efficient invisibility that Poirot immediately recognized as a cultivated art. She wore no jewellery. Her hair was brown and unadorned. She said, "How do you do?" and sat down again at once, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes moving between her employer and the door with the quiet vigilance of a woman whose livelihood depends on anticipating what is needed before it is asked. Julian Marsh occupied a wing chair by the second window. A glass of sherry balanced on his knee, and a copy of the Times folded to the crossword, as though to signal that he was a man of culture engaged in legitimate intellectual exercise. He was perhaps 50, with the prow of a nose and the deliberately rumpled look of one who has decided that carelessness, in the right circles, can pass for style. He rose, bowed fractionally, and pronounced himself enchanted. "I have read your monograph on criminal psychology," he said to Poirot. "Quite illuminating. You are very kind. I found 1 or 2 points debatable." He smiled. It was the smile of a man who had made a career of finding things debatable. The 4th guest, Dr. Harbury, having already been known to Poirot, was introduced as merely present. A quiet man called Pemberton who was something in Lady Helena's publishing house and who barely signified, or so it appeared. Poirot always attended to those who appeared not to signify. Dinner that evening was served in the long dining room, which looked directly out onto the lake. The water beyond the glass was invisible in the darkness, but one was aware of it. A weight of silence pressing against the windows, punctuated at intervals by the quiet persistence of small waves against the stone embankment. The conversation was of the kind that well-bred people maintain when they are all, in their various ways, not saying something. Books were discussed. The weather was declared unseasonable. London was agreed to be impossible. Lady Helena spoke of her current novel, something set in the Adriatic, with the detached benevolence of a parent discussing a child who has turned out tolerably well. Poirot ate his soup and observed. At the far end of the table, Richard Velmont and Clara Fenton were managing the business of not looking at each other with rather more effort than the operation required. Julian Marsh, to Poirot's left, ate with the single-minded concentration of a man who considers food beneath his attention, but cannot quite resist it. Dr. Harbury was at his best, animated, generous, filling any silence with professional good cheer. It was during the fish course that Marsh set down his fork. "Your novel, The Silent Orchard," he said, in the tone of a man raising a mildly interesting point over cards. "I have been thinking about it again lately. It struck me on rereading. Was it not, in certain essentials, based on someone real?" The table did not freeze. That would be too dramatic a word. But something changed in the quality of the air, as surely as if someone had opened a window onto the cold. Lady Helena continued to hold her wine-glass. She smiled, and the smile was perfectly composed, and Poirot watched it with the close attention of a man who does not, as a rule, miss the difference between a smile that reaches the eyes and one that merely arrives in the vicinity. "All fiction is based on someone real," she said. "That is what makes it fiction rather than invention." A silence. Richard's wineglass did not tremble. It did not need to. The slight tension in the tendons of his hand was sufficient. Clara lowered her eyes to her plate. Dr. Harbury reached for the breadbasket with expansive enthusiasm. "Shall we talk about the Adriatic novel? I confess I have been promised a sea view in the dedication, and I intend to hold Helena to it." The conversation moved. The moment passed, or seemed to. But Poirot, who had said nothing at all, turned his head almost imperceptibly toward the door to the service passage. The young maid who had been stationed there throughout dinner, a shy, pale girl with the careful posture of one accustomed to being overlooked, had gone entirely still at Marsh's question. Her hands holding a water jug had not moved. Her eyes were fixed on the middle, distance, and then the question had passed, and she breathed. Poirot made a mental note. The maid was frightened, not by the question, or not only. She was frightened in the way that someone is frightened when they hear, at last, a thing they have long been expecting to hear. He had been shown to a room on the first floor, comfortable and adequately furnished, with a view of the garden and, beyond the garden, the mass of the beaches, darker than the dark sky. After dismissing the manservant who had carried his luggage, Poirot stood for a moment at the window, regarding the night. There was the smell again. He had caught it first in the entrance hall, and again, more distinctly, as they had passed the door of the study. Faint, sweet, formal. The scent of violets. Not fresh flowers, a perfume. Old-fashioned, the kind one did not encounter much these days. It had been present in the hall, yes, but most strongly in the study. There were no flowers in the study. Poirot had looked. He drew the curtains against the dark, smoothed them to his satisfaction, and sat down in the armchair with the precise, deliberate movements of a man making himself comfortable in a place he does not entirely trust. He could hear the wind moving through the beaches. He could hear very faintly the sound of the lake. Someone here, he thought, is pretending, and someone else knows it. He sat very still in the yellow lamplight, his small, neat hands folded on his knee, and listened to the house settle around him like a creature arranging itself for sleep. Or perhaps for something other than sleep. Outside, the beaches whispered their patient, indecipherable conversation. Poirot did not sleep for quite some time. Chapter 2. A House. Full of listeners, breakfast at Belmont House was served at 8 o'clock, and it was at breakfast Poirot had long maintained that one learned more about a household than at any other hour. Dinner was a performance, luncheon a negotiation. Breakfast was simply what remained when the performance had not yet begun. He came down at 7:30 and found the dining room empty except for Eliza Ward, who was arranging the sideboard with the silent efficiency of one who prefers to complete her work before witnesses arrive. She heard his step and turned, and the expression that crossed her face was not precisely alarm. It was the look of a person who has grown so accustomed to startling easily that the reflex precedes the emotion. "Good morning," said Poirot pleasantly. He did not approach the sideboard. He took a seat at the table and occupied himself with unfolding his napkin. "The kedgeree, I think, if there is any. And perhaps coffee, if it is not too much trouble." She brought both without speaking. He thanked her with precise courtesy. She retreated to the window and became, or attempted to become, invisible. Poirot ate his kedgeree and appeared to think about nothing at all. After a while he said without looking up, "You have been at Belmont House how long, mademoiselle?" "A beat." "6 weeks, sir." "And before that?" "Various positions." A pause. "In the country, mostly." "Ah." Poirot turned a page of the small notebook he had produced from his breast pocket, though he wrote nothing in it. "Lady Helena is, I think, a considerate employer." The girl's hands, which had been straightening a candlestick that did not require straightening, went still. "Very considerate," she said with a careful emphasis that might have meant anything. Poirot nodded, as though this confirmed something moderately interesting, and returned to his kedgeree. Presently Julian Marsh arrived, followed by Richard Belmont, and the brief quiet of the room was replaced by the noise of civilized morning. Eliza Ward withdrew. Poirot observed that she did not look at Richard Belmont as she passed him. More precisely, she arranged not to look at him, which is an altogether different thing. Lady Helena appeared at 8:30, looking as though she had slept rather less than she would care to admit. There was a careful brightness about her, the brightness of someone who has dressed not for comfort, but for the maintenance of a particular impression. She accepted coffee, declined everything else, and spoke with animation about the weather and the likelihood of walking before luncheon. It was Clara Fenton who caught Poirot's attention. The secretary arrived precisely 1 minute after her employer, as a secretary of long practice will, having timed her appearance to be useful, but not intrusive. She settled in the chair to Lady Helena's left, poured a cup of tea, and opened a small leather notebook. "The Whitmore correspondence," she murmured, "and the proofs are expected Thursday." "Yes. Later, Clara." Lady Helena's voice was gentle, but there was something beneath the gentleness, a tautness, like a wire that has been tuned too high. Clara closed the notebook immediately, but her eyes for just a fraction of a second moved to Julian Marsh. Marsh was spreading marmalade on his toast with the deliberate absorption of a man who is not, in fact, absorbed in spreading marmalade at all. Poirot reached for the coffee pot and thought about the psychology of anonymous letters. Dr. Harbury had proposed the morning's amusement with characteristic enthusiasm, a tour of the grounds to take advantage of what passed in late autumn for fine weather. Lady Helena consented with the graciousness of a woman who is glad to be in motion rather than at rest. and the party assembled in the hall at 10 o'clock in various degrees of outdoor preparation. Poirot had brought with him a coat of excellent cut and a pair of stout shoes chosen some years earlier with precisely this sort of English expedition in mind. He was, in this, as in other matters, prepared. The grounds of Velmont House extended on two sides to the lake, and on the other two to the beach. Woods, which at this season created the impression of walking through a cathedral in a state of gradual dissolution. The nave golden, the transepts dark, everything pending. He fell into step beside Lady Helena as the group spread along the path. Harbury, ahead, was explaining something architectural to Richard. Clara and Marsh walked separately on opposite sides of the track, with the studied non-proximity of two people in the middle of a disagreement neither had yet acknowledged aloud. "You mentioned last evening," Poirot said, "that all fiction is based on someone real. It was elegantly put." Lady Helena smiled. The pale lake light suited her. "It is also entirely true. The Silent Orchard was published, I believe, some 15 years ago." 16. The smile did not alter. The voice, however, dropped half a register. "Mr. Marsh takes a proprietary interest in my earlier work. He is writing your biography, I understand." "He is attempting to." She glanced ahead at the figure of Marsh, who was bending to examine something at the waterline. Julian has always been better at examining the work of others than producing his own. It is a particular kind of intelligence, not an unattractive one. He possesses, perhaps, certain materials, letters, documents of a personal nature, which inform his research. This time the pause was brief but deliberate, as a held breath is deliberate. "He possesses what I have chosen to give him," Lady Helena said, "and some, I suspect, that he has acquired by other means." She turned to look directly at Poirot, and her pale grey eyes were, in that moment, very clear. "You are not, I think, principally interested in the psychology of anonymous letters." "Madame," said Poirot with perfect composure, "at present I am interested in everything equally." He paused, which is, in its own way, a form of interest in nothing. She studied him for a moment. Then she laughed. A genuine laugh, the first he had heard from her, brief and unguarded. "Leonard said you were unusual. Dr. Harbury is always very kind." Ahead, the path curved toward the stone embankment, where the lake met the garden wall. Poirot could see the still, dark surface of the water between the willows, leaden and patient. A single crow sat on the embankment stone, watching the group approach with the magisterial disapproval of an official whose appointment has been overlooked. It was on the return walk, as the house came back into view through the stripped beeches, that the small incident occurred which would occupy Poirot's thoughts for the remainder of the day. Richard Velmont had fallen back from Harbury's company and now walked some 20 yards ahead of Poirot, alone. He did not know he was observed. And it was in not knowing he was observed that he revealed what he had been careful to conceal at breakfast. He stopped at the garden gate and waited. A moment later, Clara Fenton, who had taken a slightly different path through the shrubbery, came through from the other side. They were not in conversation for long, 30 seconds, perhaps less, but their posture told a considerable story. Clara spoke. Richard listened. Clara said something that made Richard's chin come up briefly, with an expression between anger and something rawer. Then they separated, Clara going ahead to the house, Richard remaining at the gate. Poirot passed him with a pleasant nod. "Fine morning," said Poirot. Yes, said Richard. He was staring at the house. Remarkably fine. He did not sound as though he found it fine at all. Before luncheon, Poirot took it upon himself to become briefly lost. It is a useful condition, being lost in a country house. It licenses a degree of wandering that deliberate exploration would render suspect. He found the kitchen pantry, which was orderly and smelled of dried herbs and floor wax. He found the gun room, which contained 3 sporting guns, all cleaned, and a pair of walking sticks and nothing else of note. And he found, almost by accident, the study. The study was Lady Helena's own room, unmistakably. Her books lined 2 walls. Her manuscripts, in their neat folders, stood ranked along a shelf above the desk. The desk itself faced the window that looked toward the lake, and on it lay, in addition to the usual apparatus of literary work, a small object that Poirot examined without touching. A fragment of deep, richly textured paper, the colour of midnight, torn at one edge. It might have been decorative stationery. It might have been a good many things. What it was not was accidental. Someone had left it there, or someone had torn it from something larger, and either way, its presence on the desk was deliberate. Poirot stood in the doorway, his hands clasped behind his back, and looked at it for rather a long time. The scent of violets was here again, stronger now than it had been the previous evening. He withdrew to the hall and straightened a small watercolour that was, he noticed, perfectly straight already. That afternoon it rained. The guests gathered in the drawing-room with books and conversation and the self-conscious good manners of people confined by weather. The fire burned well. The lamps made the curtains glow. At 4 o'clock, Poirot asked Eliza Ward, who had come to refill the coal scuttle, a single quiet question. Had she been to this part of the country before her present position? She set the scuttle down. Her back was to the room, and she spoke in a voice pitched precisely low enough that only Poirot, nearest, could hear. Once, she said, a long time ago. She did not look at him when she said it, and she left the room quickly enough that no one would have noticed they had exchanged more than 2 words. But Poirot noticed that her jaw was set, and her hands, as she lifted the empty scuttle, were not quite steady. He looked at the fire. This house, he thought, was not simply waiting. It had been waiting for a specific event, for a particular convergence of people, for the meeting of a secret with the moment of its own destruction. What interested Poirot, always, was not what a person had done, but why they had believed, truly believed, they had no other choice. Outside, the rain intensified against the dark windows, and the lake could not be seen at all. Chapter 3. The Sealed Envelope. The sound came at 20 minutes past 7. Poirot was already awake. He had slept lightly, as he always did in unfamiliar houses, with that peculiar half-alertness of a man whose mind declines to fully surrender its watch. He had been lying in the grey pre-dawn, listening to the lake and thinking, with some care, about the fragment of dark paper he had seen on Lady Helena's desk. When the sound reached him through the floorboards, not a crash, not a cry, simply a door opened and then closed with the particular firmness of someone who has completed a purpose. He was in his dressing gown and at his own door in under a minute. The corridor was empty. Lamplight still burned at the far end. From below, nothing. He stood for a moment, listening, then returned to his room and dressed with unhurried precision. It was Clara Fenton who found her. At 7:30, Clara came downstairs to leave the morning correspondence on Lady Helena's desk, as was her established habit. The study door was not quite latched. She pushed it open, set the letters down, and saw. Lady Helena was seated at her desk. She was dressed, which was the first thing Clara registered. Dressed in the clothes she had worn to dinner the previous evening, as though she had never gone to bed. Her posture was composed, even dignified, her hands in her lap, her face turned slightly toward the window, the dark lake beyond, showing silver now in the early light. Before her, on the desk, lay a single envelope, sealed of a paper so deep in colour, midnight blue or perhaps black, impossible to say in that light, that it seemed to absorb the pale morning rather than reflect it. Clara said her employer's name. Then she said it again. Then she touched her shoulder. The scream brought the house down in under 3 minutes. Poirot was the fourth to arrive. Harbury had come first, then Richard Velmont in his dressing gown, then Marsh in a coat thrown over his pyjamas. Eliza Ward stood in the doorway and would not come further in. Clara was in the hall with her back against the wall, her arms folded across herself, her face the colour of the morning outside. Harbury was bending over Lady Helena when Poirot entered. He straightened after a moment, and the professional composure with which he turned told Poirot what the posture of the body had already suggested. "She is dead," Harbury said. "Some hours, I think, during the night." He paused. "There is no obvious sign of violence. She was melancholic at times. The question of her son has weighed heavily. I am afraid I must say what the circumstances appear to indicate." "Then do not say it yet," said Poirot mildly. Harbury looked at him. The others looked at him. Poirot was looking at the room. He looked at it with the patient thoroughness of a man reading a document he suspects of containing a deliberate error. The coal fire in the grate was cold. It had not been lit last night, or had burned out early. The lamp on the desk was still burning, turned low, its oil nearly spent. Lady Helena's pen was uncapped, set to the left of the blotter. The blotter itself showed no fresh marks. One of the small drawers in the desk was open by perhaps 1/4 of an inch, and on the surface of the desk, before the body, the envelope. Poirot did not touch it. He crouched slightly to examine it at eye level, his hands behind his back, his head tilted with that characteristic stillness that those who knew him recognized as the moment before something important was said. He said, "Nothing yet." He straightened and turned his attention to the window latch. Closed. The window itself, undisturbed, the gap between sash and frame sealed by a precise accumulation of grime that had not been broken. "The police must be called," he said at last. "Dr. Harbury, would you be good enough to telephone from the hall? The local constabulary first, and then, if I may suggest it, Scotland Yard. I believe Inspector Japp is not beyond reach at this hour." Marsh spoke from behind him. "You think this is not what it appears?" "Mr. Marsh," said Poirot, turning, "I have not yet formed a view of what it appears to be. I have formed a view of what it is not. These are quite different exercises." The envelope was opened in the presence of Harbury and Poirot, before the constable arrived from the village and established the scene with the modest authority of a man whose jurisdiction does not often include death. Inside the envelope, and Poirot had noted the quality of the paper, its unusual weight and texture, the precise dark blue that was neither black nor navy but something between. There was a single sheet, folded once. On it, in a handwriting that was not Lady Helena's, 7 words. "You promised never to tell." That was all. Richard Velmont, who had positioned himself near the door, said nothing. He looked at the paper and the muscles around his jaw tightened, and then he looked away, out of the window. Marsh said softly, "Good God." Harbury read it twice, and then set it down, very carefully in precisely the centre of the desk. Poirot, who had read it at a glance and committed it entirely to memory, was watching Richard Velmont. The local man, Constable Briggs, solid, deliberate, not unclever, secured the study and interviewed the household in the parlour. He was methodical in the way that country policemen sometimes are. No speed, no glamour, but a thorough patience that covered the ground. He noted the envelope, the handwriting, the disposition of the body, and the statements of all present. It was during these proceedings that the handkerchief was discovered. Harbury, in the process of describing his initial medical examination, mentioned that Lady Helena's right hand, when he had first lifted it, had been loosely closed around a small object. He had taken it for a handkerchief and set it aside. He had set it, in fact, on the corner of the desk, and there it still lay. A square of white silk edged with narrow embroidery, bearing in one corner the monogram V. Every person in the room turned with a single, unhurried collective movement to look at Richard Velmont. Richard did not flush. He went, instead, very still, in the manner of a man who has been struck and is deciding whether to acknowledge the blow. "That," he said after a pause of perhaps 4 seconds, "is not mine." "It bears your initials," Constable Briggs observed. "I am aware of what it bears. It is not mine." He looked, briefly, at the handkerchief. "Or rather, it is not one I have ever owned. I have not been in this study since yesterday afternoon." "You were not, perhaps, here last evening? After dinner, say?" "I was not." The constable wrote something in his notebook. The atmosphere in the parlour underwent the subtle alteration that occurs when a group of people has collectively arrived at a conclusion, and some among them are uncomfortable with how quickly they have arrived at it. Poirot, seated near the fireplace, appeared to be engaged in a minute examination of the grain of the mantelpiece. He was, in fact, watching Clara Fenton. Clara had not looked at Richard when the handkerchief was named. She had looked at the window, then at her own hands, then at a point in the middle distance that contained nothing. Her face had not changed, which, Poirot considered, required a more considerable effort than anyone in the room was giving her credit for. By midday, the household had fragmented. Richard sat alone in the library with a glass of whisky he was not drinking. Julian Marsh had retired to his room and, according to Eliza, could be heard moving about it at length. Dr. Harbury sat with Constable Briggs and gave his professional opinion with measured care. Clara organised the postponement of Lady Helena's correspondence with a mechanical thoroughness that is either great composure or its near neighbour. Poirot walked around the lake. It took perhaps 20 minutes at a moderate pace. The path was soft, with fallen leaves, ochre and brown, silenced underfoot by the rain of the previous night. The beech trunks were dark with damp. The lake, now that the morning had fully arrived, was the colour of pewter, flat and still, offering nothing back. He walked with his hands behind him and thought about several things in sequence. He thought about the note and the handwriting on it, which was not Lady Helena's, and which had been formed with some care by someone writing in a hand other than their natural one. He thought about the handkerchief and the very particular deliberateness of its placement. For a dying woman clutching something in distress will grip. She will not arrange. He thought about the scent of violets which had been present in the study again this morning, faint but unmistakable, and which did not belong to Lady Helena. He thought about the door he had heard close at 20 minutes past 7. Then he stopped walking. He had reached the far end of the embankment, where the stone met the roots of an old willow, and the water came closest to the path. He stood and looked at the lake for a considerable time. Lady Helena had not written that note. She had not placed that handkerchief in her own hand. She had not died in that study simply because the evidence arranged around her suggested she had wished to do so. What had been arranged was not a death. What had been arranged was a story. And a story, Poirot reflected, turning from the lake, is always told by someone. He walked back toward the house with rather more purpose than he had walked away from it. Chapter 4. The Fracturing of Trust. Inspector Japp arrived from London on the 2 o'clock train, accompanied by a sergeant of compact efficiency and an expression that suggested the journey from Paddington had not agreed with him. He shook Poirot's hand in the drive with the hearty exasperation of a man who is simultaneously glad and annoyed to find his old acquaintance already on the premises. "Of all the country houses in England," Japp said, surveying the facade of Velmont with a policeman's instinctive distrust of anything impressive, "you manage to be staying in the one where somebody turns up dead. Mon ami, you say this as though it were a pattern." "It is a pattern." Japp turned up his collar against the wind off the lake. "What have you got?" "At present," said Poirot, falling into step beside him toward the door, "I have a great many things that are not quite right. I have not yet got the one thing that is." He paused. "But I am forming a view of its shape." Japp grunted. It was the grunt of a man who has learned that this is the most he will receive at this stage of proceedings, and has made his peace with it. Japp conducted his interviews in the parlour, with Sergeant Howell at a small table by the window. Poirot attended in the capacity of an interested observer, seated apart from the proceedings in a manner which suggested that he was thinking of something else entirely and which deceived no one. Richard Velmont came first, at his own insistence. He had changed from his morning clothes into something darker and more considered, which Poirot noted without comment. He sat with his back straight and his hands flat on his knees, and repeated his denial with an emphasis that had hardened since the morning, as denial sometimes does when a man has had several hours in which to rehearse it. "The handkerchief is not mine. I was not in that study after 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon. I have no knowledge of any letter." He looked at Japp directly. "My aunt was not a woman who took her own life. I knew her. Whatever that envelope is meant to suggest, I do not believe it." "You had a financial interest in your aunt's continued good health?" Japp asked. A brief hesitation. Expensive, that hesitation. Poirot saw Japp clock it with the quiet satisfaction of a fisherman watching a float. "She was generous to me," Richard said. "We were not always in accord, but she was generous." "Not always in accord. On what subjects?" Richard's gaze moved for the first time to Poirot. It was a glance of perhaps half a second, and it contained something, not a plea precisely, but the awareness of a man who knows that he is being watched by someone more attentive than the person asking questions. "The past," he said at last. "We disagreed about the past." Japp let the silence extend for several seconds, which is a reliable technique for extracting further speech from those who find silence uncomfortable. Richard Velmont found it uncomfortable. He looked at his hands, but he said nothing further, and Japp moved on. Before he left the room, Richard stopped at the door. He addressed the remark not to Jap but to the middle distance, in the tone of a man discharging an obligation he has been debating. Helena received anonymous letters, he said. Several over the past month. She told me herself. I should have said so this morning. I did not think it relevant. He did not wait to hear whether anyone believed this, and left. Julian Marsh conducted his interview with the polished ease of a man accustomed to speaking in public about delicate matters and presenting them as merely intellectual ones. He had, he explained, been Lady Helena's authorized biographer for 2 years. He had in his possession a collection of her private correspondence spanning some 30 years, all furnished by Lady Helena herself in the context of their professional arrangement. All furnished by her, Jap said. Marsh smiled with one half of his face. She was a generous subject. She understood that a biography has value precisely in proportion to its candour. And the letters she gave you? Nothing in them that might be considered damaging to anyone living? Letters are rarely without interest to someone, Marsh said. That is why they are kept. He straightened his cufflinks. Helena was a woman of wide acquaintance and long memory. Whether anything in the correspondence is in any sense actionable is a question for lawyers, not biographers. He had said, Poirot observed, a great deal while making it difficult to identify precisely what he had said. It was an accomplished performance. The difficulty with accomplished performances is that they require an audience, and Poirot was, at the moment, not the sort of audience that applauds. You remarked, at dinner, Poirot said from his corner, upon the silent orchard. You suggested it was based on a real person. Marsh turned. He had the look of a man who had been hoping this would not come up, and had simultaneously been preparing for it. A casual observation, literary conversation. The table did not receive it as casual. Dinner tables rarely receive anything as casual. It is the nature of the form. He met Poirot's gaze with professional steadiness. I made an observation about a novel. I did not make an accusation. No, said Poirot, but you watched very carefully to see how each person responded to it. That I did observe. Marsh was quiet for a moment. Then he stood, settled his jacket, and offered Jap a small nod. I have nothing further to add. He went to the door and then, as Richard had done, paused. She was frightened, he said. In the last week particularly. I noticed it. I assumed it was the letters Richard mentioned. I did not ask her. Something crossed his expression that might, in a less contained man, have been regret. I should have asked her. Clara Fenton's interview was the shortest and the most carefully constructed. She had been Lady Helena's secretary for 11 years. She managed the manuscripts, the correspondence, the domestic arrangements, the literary contracts, and what she termed, with a delicacy that Poirot found interesting, the private administrative requirements of the household. You were close to Lady Helena. I was useful to her, Clara said, which is a different thing. She valued competence more than intimacy. Did she confide in you, her concerns, her fears? She mentioned that she was tired, Clara said, and that there were matters she intended to resolve. She did not specify. The anonymous letters. Were you aware of them? Clara's hands, folded in her lap, did not move. She showed me one, approximately 3 weeks ago. She asked me to note the postmark. It had been sent from a post office in Holborn. And the content of that letter, a pause, precise and measured. It said that what had been hidden would soon be uncovered. Jap and Poirot exchanged no glance. They did not need to. "One further question," Poirot said. "The handkerchief, the one found in Lady Helena's hand. You are certain it belongs to Mr. Velmont?" Clara looked at him with dark, steady eyes. "I said no such thing," she replied. "I have not been asked until now, and I have no opinion on the matter." It was, Poirot thought, a remarkably careful answer. A lawyer might have been proud of it. Dr. Harbury's interview lasted longer than the others. He spoke of Lady Helena with the measured fondness of a physician describing a patient of many years, with warmth, but with the warmth tempered by professional distance. He had treated her, he explained, for episodes of anxiety and melancholia over the course of nearly a decade. He had seen her most recently on a visit to London 6 weeks prior. Her mental state at that time. Purposeful, Harbury said. He chose the word with a precision that suggested it had been selected from several alternatives. She was exercised, certainly, but the quality of her feeling was not despair, it was resolve. He spread his hands. I would not have described her as a woman contemplating self-destruction. I would have said the opposite. She was, perhaps, contemplating something else, Poirot offered. Harbury looked at him. His expression was one of open, guileless attention. But there is a kind of openness that is itself a door, carefully positioned to draw the eye away from what is behind it. She was contemplating resolution, he said. Of old troubles, she did not elaborate. She did not name the troubles. She spoke of her son. She always spoke of her son when she was in distress. He paused. It was the wound that would not heal. 20 years a wound heals. 10 years. Not always. He said this last quietly, and with what appeared to be genuine feeling, and Poirot listened to it with the same attention he gave to everything in that room. Genuine feeling, he had observed, is not incompatible with deception. Sometimes it is, in fact, its most useful companion. That evening Japp sat with Poirot in the study, the body having been removed, the room released, and reviewed his notes with the focused irritation of a man who has found a great deal of evidence, and very little of it pointing in one direction. The handkerchief is enough to hold Velmont for questioning, he said. Means motive. He stands to inherit substantially. The note could be his work. The note, said Poirot, was written by someone attempting to disguise their natural hand. This tells us two things, that the writer was known to Lady Helena, and that they expected the note to be read by others. A note from a stranger requires no disguise. Agreed, but Velmont... The handkerchief was placed, said Poirot. Not gripped, not held, placed, and placed by someone who wished us to look at Richard Velmont. He was quiet for a moment, which means that someone else is very anxious that we should not look elsewhere. Japp tapped his pen against his notebook. Outside, the wind off the lake pressed against the study window with a low, continuous sound, like a person leaning against a door that is not quite shut. You said this morning, Japp said, that you knew the shape of the thing. Bigger now? Considerably bigger, said Poirot. He looked at the desk where the velvet envelope had lain, now marked with Constable Briggs's small evidence ticket. What troubles me, my friend, is not the death before us. It is the death behind it. This crime did not begin 2 nights ago. It began 10 years ago, at the very least. He turned from the desk. And those who were present then are all of them present now. Japp said nothing to this. There was, for the moment, nothing useful to say. This wind pressed on. Chapter 5. Confessions within confessions. The second morning at Velmont House had a different quality to the first. The copper and gold of the beaches, which had seemed merely atmospheric 2 days prior, now struck Poirot as the colours of something ending. The wind had dropped. The lake was glassy and absolute. Even the birds were quiet, as though they too had been asked to wait. Japp had gone to the village the previous evening to arrange for the post-mortem examination and to send certain telegrams. He returned at breakfast with the face of a man whose telegrams have been answered promptly, which is to say, with the face of a man who has received confirmation of several things he suspected and one he did not. "Velmont's finances," he said, accepting coffee from Poirot with the ease of long acquaintance. Worse than he let on. Debts of a particular kind, not gambling, not the usual. Business ventures. 3 of them. All failed, all in the last 4 years. He needed Helena's money, and he needed it soon. And the letters? The anonymous ones? Postmarks from 2 different London offices. Different paper, same construction. Whoever sent them was careful, but not professional. Poirot set down his cup. "There is," he said, "a meaningful distinction between careful and professional. The professional criminal anticipates scrutiny. The careful amateur fears it. The fear is itself informative." Japp gave him the look he reserved for remarks of this nature, not dismissive exactly, but the look of a man who has learned not to ask for an explanation until one is offered voluntarily. He reached for the toast. Poirot spoke with Richard Velmont alone, at Richard's own request, in the library after luncheon. The request itself was significant. A man who has been publicly associated with a handkerchief bearing his initials and who has not been arrested exists for a time in a particular condition, past the shock of accusation, not yet arrived at strategy. In that interval, people sometimes tell the truth, simply because it is less effortful than maintaining the alternative. Richard stood at the window with his back to the room, looking at the lake. He did not speak immediately when Poirot settled into the armchair. He seemed to be arranging something, though whether it was his thoughts or his resolve was not yet clear. "I hated him," he said at last. Poirot waited. "Edmund, my cousin, Helena's son." Richard's voice was flat, as voices become when old feeling has been compressed into something manageable. "From the time we were boys, he was everything I was supposed to be. The heir, the clever one, the one she looked at. I was the poor relation who came to stay at Christmas and was permitted to use the library." He turned from the window. His expression was the particular expression of a man making his first honest accounting. "I did not harm him," he said. "I want that established plainly. I was not present when he died or disappeared or whatever word one uses for what happened at that lake 10 years ago. I was in London. I have evidence of it. Witnesses. A hotel bill. Japp will find it if he looks." "Then why?" Poirot said. "Did you not say this immediately?" Richard looked at him steadily. "Because the moment Edmund came into any conversation at this house, things became dangerous. I have watched it for 10 years. I did not want to open that door in front of everyone." He paused. "I was also, if you will have it honestly, afraid. Not of being charged. My alibi is solid. Afraid of what the door leads to. And what does it lead to, in your view?" The silence that followed was not the silence of a man unwilling to answer. It was the silence of a man deciding how much of the answer he can see. "Helena believed Edmund was murdered," Richard said. "She told me so 2 years ago, on the anniversary of his death. She said she had known it for some time and that she was gathering what she needed to prove it. He looked down at his hands. She asked me if I knew who had last seen him alive. I told her it was I. A beat. That was the truth. I saw him at the edge of the South Wood in the late afternoon. He was running. Running from what? From the direction of the house. Richard's jaw tightened. I called to him. He did not stop. That was the last I saw of him. He looked at Poirot with something that might, in other circumstances, have been appeal. I have told no one that, until this moment, not the inquest, not Helena. I was 24 and frightened, and the official conclusion was accidental drowning, and I told myself, for 10 years I told myself, that it made no difference. He stopped. It made a difference, said Poirot quietly. Not as an accusation, simply as a fact, stated in the manner of facts that have waited some time to be spoken. Richard nodded once and turned back to the window. He found Clara Fenton in the small sitting room on the first floor, a room that appeared to serve no social purpose, but which she had evidently adopted as a refuge, for she was seated there alone, with no book, no correspondence, no pretense of occupation. She was simply sitting, looking at a watercolour of the Cornish coast, as though the horizon in it offered something the horizon outside did not. She heard him come in and did not turn. "I wondered when you would come," she said. Poirot sat in the chair at a comfortable distance, not close enough to press, not so far as to suggest the conversation might be avoided. "The handkerchief," he said. Clara turned from the watercolour. Her face, in the grey afternoon light, was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "It was mine," she said. "I bought it for him 3 years ago for his birthday, because I did not know what else to buy, and it seemed the sort of thing one gives. He left it here once after a visit, and I kept it in my desk. I did not examine my reasons for keeping it." She said this last with a precise self-awareness that confirmed what Poirot had already suspected. Clara Fenton was not a woman who acted without understanding herself. What she did, she chose. The question was always what the choice had cost. "You placed it in Lady Helena's hand," Poirot said. A long pause. Clara looked at her own hands. "Yes," she said, "to protect him." To confuse the picture. She raised her eyes. They were going to look at Richard regardless. The will, the debts, the history between them. "I thought if the handkerchief was there, it would be too obvious, too neat, that a detective, a real detective, would see through it, and that it would create uncertainty rather than certainty." She stopped. "I miscalculated the speed at which a household forms its opinions." "You miscalculated," Poirot agreed with a gentleness that did not diminish the observation, "that an obvious clue and an absent clue are not the same thing. The handkerchief created not doubt but suspicion, and suspicion of a particular person is more dangerous than evidence." Clara absorbed this in silence. Then, "I did not kill her," she said. "I found her. I touched nothing except to confirm what I already knew. Then I took the handkerchief from my pocket." She looked at the watercolour again. "She was the only security I have ever had. The work, the position, the sense that I was of use to something that mattered. Without her, I am a woman of 40 with an excellent reference and no ground beneath her." The words were without self-pity. They were, if anything, merely accurate. "Lady Helena was researching her son's disappearance," Poirot said. "You knew this?" "I helped her," Clara said. "For 2 years. Letters, newspaper archives, old records. She believed Edmund had discovered something and been killed to prevent him speaking of it. She would not say who she suspected, but she was close, very close in the last month, to having what she needed to act on it. And then she died. And then she died. Clara folded her hands once more. The person who killed Helena had very little time left in which to act. That is what I know. I do not know who it was, but I know the space they were working in was almost closed. Julian Marsh was packing. Poirot found him in his room with a leather case open on the bed and 2 suits already folded inside with the methodical efficiency of someone who packs frequently. Marsh looked up without embarrassment. "Japp has asked me not to leave the county," he said. "I am rearranging, not departing." "The letters," said Poirot. "Helena's letters, the ones in your possession." Marsh set down the shirt he was holding. He looked at Poirot with the assessment of a man calibrating how much is already known. She wrote to a number of people across 40 years. Colleagues, editors, 1 or 2 individuals who were not colleagues or editors. He paused. One, correspondence in particular, was of a more private character. "With whom?" Marsh reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, hanging on the chair, and withdrew a folded sheet. He held it without offering it across. "I have been deciding," he said, "whether to show this to the police or to burn it. Helena gave it to me 18 months ago, sealed, with instructions to open it only if something happened to her. He offered it then. Poirot unfolded it with care. It was a single page in Lady Helena's unmistakable hand, the pen strokes forceful and neat. It named no person directly, but it stated in precise and unambiguous language that Edmund Velmont had come to her in the week before his death, in a state of acute distress. He had told her that he had uncovered evidence of something terrible. He had told her the name of the person he had told. There was a single name on the page. Poirot read it and refolded the letter, and was quiet for the span of several measured breaths. "She sent this to you," he said, because she trusted that a biographer's instinct for preservation would outlast other pressures. "She knew me rather well," Marsh said. He watched Poirot's face with the attention of a man reading weather. "Is it enough?" "It is," said Poirot, "the shape I was looking for." He set the letter carefully on the chest of drawers beside him and looked out at the beechwood through the narrow window. What is enough and what is justice are not always the same thing, but we are closer now to both. Marsh looked at the letter on the chest of drawers and did not pick it up again. Chapter 6. The Weight of Silence. He had been putting off the conversation with Eliza Ward. This was not evasion. Poirot did not evade. It was, rather, a form of preparation. The same instinct that leads a surgeon to set out his instruments with care before making the first incision. He had spoken to the others and gathered from them what they were willing to give, and, in several cases, considerably more than that. But the maid's particular silence was of a different order. It was not the silence of self-protection, nor of calculated disclosure, nor of the careful management of reputation. It was the silence of someone who has been carrying something alone for so long that the act of setting it down has become unimaginable. Those silences, Poirot knew, do not yield to interrogation. They yield only to patience and to the particular quality of attention that communicates itself without words. The attention that says, "I am not here to judge what you tell me, but to understand it." He found her in the kitchen garden in the cold of the late afternoon, cutting back the last of the season's herbs with the focused industry of someone who needs her hands occupied. The kitchen garden was walled, sheltered from the wind off the lake, and smelled of damp earth and bruised rosemary. The light was going. He did not approach directly. He stood near the gate and looked at the beds for a moment with apparent interest. "Lavender," he observed, indicating a grey-stemmed row near the wall. "One does not often see it kept this late in the season." Eliza glanced up. She had the wariness of a creature that has learned not to be caught off guard, but something in his manner, the absence of urgency perhaps, or simply the unexpectedness of lavender as an opening, seemed to loosen a fraction of that wariness. "Lady Helena kept it for the scent," she said. "She said it helped her sleep." A practical woman in some respects. Poirot moved along the path at a contemplative pace, not towards her, but parallel. "You grew up in the countryside, I think, a different part of England." "Dorset, mostly, and then Wiltshire for a time." "And before your present position, you mentioned having been in this part of the country once before." He stopped and looked at the lavender and said it as though it were merely a continuation of the conversation. "The village near the South Wood, the village where Edmund Velmont disappeared." The cutting shears were still. The kitchen garden held its breath. "Yes," she said. She told it without preamble. Once she had begun. Poirot had the impression of someone reciting a thing they have rehearsed in private so many times that the words have worn smooth with use, and come now without friction. Not easily, but inevitably. 10 years ago she had been 19 in service at a farm on the eastern edge of the estate. The farm bordered the South Wood on its upper side. In October of that year, on a Thursday evening in the early dark, she had been returning from the village along the footpath that cut through the wood's lower margin, when she had heard someone running on the path ahead of her. She had stepped back into the trees. A boy had come past her at speed. Young, 15 or 16, she had thought. Slight, dark-haired, white about the face with something that was not merely exertion. Behind him, perhaps 20 yards back, a man. Not running, walking fast with the purposeful unhurriedness of someone who is confident of the outcome. He had passed within 10 feet of where she stood in the shadow of the beeches. She had seen his face clearly in the last of the light. She stopped speaking. "You knew him," Poirot said. Not a question. Not by name, not then. She set the shears down on the low wall. "I had seen him that afternoon, arriving at the house in a motor car. One of the guests." Her voice was steady, the steadiness of great effort. "I did not know until weeks later when I saw a photograph in the newspaper, a piece about Lady Helena's new novel, who he was." "And when you knew?" Her jaw shifted. "I told myself I had not seen clearly, that it was dark, that the boy had run on and perhaps reached the road safely, and that what I thought I had seen was not what it was." She looked at the lavender. "I told myself these things for 10 years. They did not become more convincing with repetition." "No," said Poirot. "They rarely do. When I heard the position here was vacant, I applied for it." She met his eyes for the first time since she had begun speaking. "I am not certain what I intended. I think I wanted to be near it, near the truth of it, as though proximity might resolve something." She looked down. It did not. "Until now," said Poirot gently. She said nothing to this, but something in her posture, the long particular tension of it, shifted very slightly, as a cable shifts when the weight it has been bearing is at last transferred elsewhere. He returned to the house by the garden gate and found Japp waiting for him in the hall with a telegram in his hand and the expression of a man who has received both good news and complicated news and is uncertain which is which. "Harbury," Japp said without preamble. "His medical license. I had the matter looked into properly this time. He lost it in 1921 for 8 months. Conduct unbecoming a physician. The official record is sealed, but the substance of the complaint was irregular experimentation on patients without informed consent." He folded the telegram. Patients at a private clinic in Berkshire. Patients suffering from trauma and nervous disorders. He was treating them with experimental techniques, pharmacological, some of it. Undisclosed, unauthorized. 3 patients suffered serious harm. Poirot received this without visible surprise. "He was reinstated," he said. "Reinstated, cautioned, and the record sealed on condition of future compliance. The clinic closed. The patients, or rather their families, were compensated quietly." Japp tucked the telegram into his breast pocket. "He has not practiced in an institutional setting since. Private patients only. Selected, one imagines, with some care." "Selected," Poirot agreed, "for their discretion as much as their condition." He removed his hat and set it on the hall table with a precision that suggested he was buying himself a moment of thought. Edmund Velmont was 15 years old and residing at Velmont House in the October of his disappearance. He would have had access to the house, to its guests, to its papers. A curious boy, and he was by all accounts a curious boy. In a house where a man with a secret was a frequent visitor. "You think the boy found out about the experimentation?" "I think the boy found proof of it," Poirot said. "A distinction of some importance. Finding out is a private event. Finding proof is a social one. It implies action." Japp was quiet for a moment. Then, "Harbury was at the house that weekend, 10 years ago. I checked the old visitors' book. Briggs had the presence of mind to secure it before it was disturbed. Harbury's name is there, along with 4 others. And Edmund told him," Poirot said, "that he had found the proof. Perhaps with the directness of a boy who has not yet learned that there are people in the world who will respond to an ultimatum with something other than capitulation." They stood in the hall for a moment, in the yellow lamplight, with the portraits on the staircase regarding them from their permanent distance. That night, at 10:30, someone entered Lady Helena's study. Poirot heard it from the corridor. A faint mechanical sound, the particular complaint of a specific drawer that he had noted on his first inspection of the room, ran slightly stiff in its runners. He had noted it as the sort of thing one notices and files away without knowing why, which is, in his experience, precisely the category of observation that later proves essential. He did not move quickly. Quick movement in a dark house produces noise and achieves less than stillness. He positioned himself in the shadow of the corridor alcove, where the lamp at the far end did not reach, and waited. 2 minutes passed, perhaps 3. Then the study door opened and a figure came out carrying nothing visible, moving with the careful speed of someone who has done what they came to do. The lamp at the corridor's end caught the figure for a fraction of a second before it turned the other way. It was enough. Poirot did not follow. Instead, he waited another full minute, then entered the study himself. The drawer in question, the third on the left, below the manuscript shelf, was closed, but not entirely as it had been. He opened it. It was empty. Where there had been a quantity of the deep-coloured velvet paper, 6 or 7 sheets he had estimated on his earlier inspection, there was now nothing. The stationery was gone. He looked at the empty drawer for a long time. Then he looked at the desk and the window and the cold fireplace and the shelf of manuscripts above. Then he went to the door of the study, turned off the lamp, and stood in the dark for a moment, thinking. The theft of the stationery was not a practical act. The letter had already been found, already examined, already noted in official records. Removing the remaining paper from which it had been made could not unmake any of that. It could only tell Poirot one thing, that the person who had taken it was afraid not of the evidence already in hand, but of what a careful examination of the remaining sheets might reveal. A chemical comparison, perhaps, a match of batch or manufacture, something that could not be accounted for by coincidence, something that would place the letter's origin not in Lady Helena's hands, but in someone else's entirely. The house was very quiet. The lake outside moved with its slow, patient sound against the stone. Poirot murmured to nobody in particular. There is always a third possibility. He went back to his room and sat in the armchair for quite some time, and the little grey cells performed their careful work in the dark. Chapter 7. The Mirror Shatters. He rose before the house. At 6 o'clock, the lake was indistinguishable from the sky, both the same pale, exhausted grey. And the beeches stood in the mist like figures that had been waiting there considerably longer than the house itself. Poirot, dressed with his customary precision, adjusted his moustaches in the glass with the care of a man who considers appearances the first discipline of the mind, and sat for 20 minutes in the armchair without moving. He was reconstructing, not the crime as it had been presented to him, the sealed study, the velvet envelope, the body composed in its terrible stillness, but the crime beneath that one, the older architecture. He laid it out in his mind with the methodical patience of a man arranging a complex mechanism on a workbench, fitting each component to its neighbour until the whole became intelligible. Edmund Velmont, 15 years old, October 10 years ago. He had been, by all accounts, a boy of acute observation and considerable moral seriousness, qualities that are, in combination, among the more dangerous a young person can possess, when the world around them contains a secret that wishes to remain one. He had found something, the precise nature of the documentation, whether letters, clinical notes, patient records illicitly retained, was not yet established, but its substance was. Evidence of Harbury's unauthorized experimentation, the same experimentation that had cost him his license and bought him his sealed record. The boy had gone to Harbury with it. He had gone, Poirot thought, with the directness of someone who has not yet learned to be afraid of the people who should be trustworthy. He had perhaps expected remorse or confession, or the grateful acceptance of an opportunity to make things right. He had not expected what he received. And then he had run. Richard had seen him running from the house. Eliza had seen him running through the wood, with Harbury behind him. The lake had taken the rest. Whether Edmund had fallen in his panic, or whether the lake had been assisted, was the question that had occupied Lady Helena for 10 years, and which had finally brought them all, with the inexorability of water finding its level, to this particular house, this particular morning. He went at 6:30 to Dr. Harbury's room. He did not knock immediately. He stood outside the door for a moment, and it was in that moment that he noticed it. The scent, faint, unmistakable, drifting from beneath the door, with the persistence of something that has permeated fabric and leather and the lining of a bag over many years of use. violets, the same perfume that had haunted the study since before Lady Helena's body was found. The same perfume that had no business being in that room because Helena had worn no perfume and there were no flowers, and the scent did not belong to the house at all. It belonged to Harbury's bag. Poirot had seen it there on the first evening. A small glass bottle with a silver-topped stopper, the kind of object that accumulates in a doctor's travelling case over years and is neither used nor discarded. A woman's perfume, old-fashioned even by the standards of the present day. He had noted it as an anomaly and passed on. Now the anomaly had a context. Harbury's wife had died 4 years ago. He had spoken of her once, briefly, to Jap. A remark about her fondness for the countryside that had arrived and departed in a single sentence. The perfume bottle, Poirot now understood, was not kept for use. It was kept for the particular, private cruelty of grief that makes a person retain the scent of someone lost, because the alternative is losing them again in a different and more final way. What it meant was this. The perfume in the study had come from Harbury's bag. Harbury had been in the study before the body was discovered. Harbury had been in the study, in all probability, while the body was still warm. He knocked. Harbury answered after a long interval, fully dressed. He had the look of a man who has not slept and has stopped pretending to himself that he might. He stepped back from the door without a word of invitation, which served as one, and Poirot entered. The room was ordered to a degree that went somewhat beyond the ordinary habits of a house guest. The bag on the stand was buckled. The books he had brought were stacked with their spines aligned. The surface of the writing table was clear except for a single sheet of paper, face down, which Harbury made no move to conceal and no move to explain. Poirot sat, uninvited, in the chair by the window. Harbury remained standing. Between them, in the early light, the mist outside the glass was beginning, very slowly, to dissolve. "The perfume," said Poirot, without preliminary. "Your wife's. It is in your bag. It was also on the morning of Lady Helena's death and on the evening preceding it, in the study. This is not a coincidence one can accommodate without effort." Harbury looked at the window, not out of it, at it, as one looks at a surface rather than through it when one does not wish to see what is on the other side. "I went to the study at 11 o'clock that night," he said. "I had gone to speak with Helena about what she intended to do." He paused for a period that had a specific quality. Not the pause of a man deciding whether to lie, but the pause of a man who has rehearsed the truth and finds, now that the moment has come, that it is heavier than rehearsal suggested. "She was already dead when I arrived." "You did not call out. You did not raise the alarm." "No." "Why not?" He turned from the window then and looked at Poirot with the directness of a man making what he has decided will be his one concession to honesty. "Because I knew what it would look like," he said, "and because, I will not deny it, in those first minutes I thought only of myself, what I had done, what could be exposed." He moved to the chair beside the writing table and sat down heavily. "I left the study and went back to my room. I told myself I would think of what to do. I spent the night thinking and arrived at nothing useful." "The velvet stationery," Poirot said, "which you removed from the study drawer last night." The silence that followed was of a different quality to those that had preceded it. "You were in the corridor," Harbury said. "I was in the corridor." Harbury looked at the face-down sheet of paper on the writing table. For a moment, Poirot thought he might reach for it. He did not. "The stationery was mine," he said. "I brought it to the house. I placed it in her desk drawer some weeks ago, on a previous visit, so that it would be found there and appear to be hers." He stopped. "I also wrote the letter." The room absorbed this admission as the mist outside was absorbing the dawn. Slowly, and with the complete absence of drama that attends the arrival of things long expected. "You did not kill her," said Poirot. It was not quite a question. Harbury heard the distinction. "I did not kill her," he said. "I prepared the scene after I found her. The letter, the envelope, the arrangement of her hands." He looked down at the floor. "I thought, if it appeared to be a voluntary death, a private farewell, then whatever she had been investigating would be laid to rest with her, that there would be no further inquiry, that it would end." "And Edmund," said Poirot quietly, 10 years ago." The mist had thinned entirely by the time Harbury finished speaking, and the lake was visible again through the window, flat, silver, and without mercy. He had spoken for some time with the toneless precision of a man delivering a report he has composed and recomposed over a decade until the language has been worn to something almost clinical. Edmund had come to him in the study on the Thursday evening. He had shown him a folder of documents, patient records Harbury had left carelessly in his medical bag during an earlier visit, which the boy had found and read and copied, with the thoroughness of someone who understands that evidence requires duplication. He had told Harbury that he intended to send the copies to the General Medical Council. He had given him until the following morning. Harbury had followed him from the house. "He was running," Harbury said. "He had realized, I think, that I was not going to simply accept it. I called to him to stop. I had no intention of—" He stopped. He began again. He was frightened. He ran toward the lake path. There was a section of the embankment that was crumbling. It had been reported to the groundsman and not yet repaired. He did not know it. I did. A long pause. I did not push him, but I did not call out a warning. I did not tell him the stone was unsafe. I let him run, and I heard the stone give way, and I heard the water." He said this last with the flatness of a man describing something he has heard 10,000 times in the silence of his own nights, and no longer requires an audience to witness. "And afterwards," said Poirot, "you returned to the house." "I returned to the house. I said nothing. I allowed the assumption to stand." He looked at Poirot at last, steadily and without deflection. "I told myself that I had not touched him, that the stone had given way, that it might have happened regardless." The steadiness in his gaze did not falter, but something behind it, some final, exhausted resistance, was visibly giving way, like the stone at the embankment's edge. "I have told myself this so many times that I can no longer hear the words. They have lost all meaning." Poirot was quiet for a moment. He looked at the man across from him, not with anger, not with the satisfaction of a puzzle resolved, but with the particular sadness that attends the discovery of a waste that might, at any one of 100 junctures, have been otherwise. "You spent 10 years, Poirot said at last, teaching yourself why it was necessary. And the teaching has not, I think, brought you any peace." Harbury said nothing. On the writing table between them, the face-down sheet of paper lay where it had lain throughout. Poirot did not ask what was written on it. He thought, with a quiet certainty, that he already knew. Outside, the lake lay still and silver and absolute, holding its own counsel, as it had held it for 10 years. Chapter 8. The trap is set. He left Harbury's room as he had entered it, without haste, without visible agitation, with the composed and slightly abstracted air of a man whose thoughts are already in the next room. On the landing he paused, one hand resting on the newel post, and looked down into the hall below where the morning light was beginning to come through the high window above the door, laying a pale rectangle across the Turkey rug. He stood there for nearly a minute. The difficulty was not the guilt. The guilt was, in its essential structure, clear enough. Harbury had staged Helena's death to suppress an investigation that would have destroyed him. He had arranged a scene designed to suggest voluntary departure and planted evidence, the velvet letter, the borrowed stationery, intended to foreclose inquiry. That was tampering with a body, obstruction, and conduct that a prosecutor would find straightforward to characterize. The difficulty was Edmund, a boy at a crumbling embankment running in the dark. A man who knew the stone was unsafe and said nothing. No hand raised and no blow struck, no act that any law Poirot was aware of could designate with certainty. A silence where a warning might have been. The difference between what the law could prove and what had, in point of moral fact, occurred was a gap through which 10 years of comfortable practice had passed unmolested, and which might, in the hands of a sufficiently skilled advocate, continue to offer comfortable passage. Poirot descended the stairs. He required Japp. And he required, before he spoke to Japp, to think very carefully about what he was going to say. He found the inspector in the dining room with a pot of tea and Sergeant Howell's notes, which he was reading with the concentrated displeasure of a man who suspects he has missed something and cannot identify what. He looked up when Poirot entered. Whatever he saw in Poirot's face was sufficient to make him set the notes down. "You've got it," Japp said. "I have had it for some hours," Poirot replied, taking the chair opposite and accepting tea with a small nod of thanks. "What I have been determining is the order in which to proceed." "The order seems straightforward enough. You tell me. I arrest someone." "The order," said Poirot, "is of considerable importance precisely because not everything I know is of the same legal quality. Some of it is confession, some of it is inference, it is the testimony of a witness who has lived 10 years with what she saw and will require, I think, a degree of careful handling before she can be asked to repeat it in formal surroundings." He wrapped both hands around his teacup. "I am going to tell you everything, but I ask that you allow me to proceed in a particular way this morning. There is one thing I wish to establish before the household assembles, and I cannot establish it through conversation alone." Japp studied him for a moment with the experienced regard of a man who has conducted this negotiation many times before and knows both its terms and its limits. "What do you need?" "The velvet envelope, the original. It is still in your sergeant's evidence case, I believe." "It is." "I need it returned to the study, placed on the desk precisely as it was found, and I need the household gathered in that room at 10 o'clock. He paused. "Not instructed to come. Invited. There is a difference in how people arrive." Japp reached for his cup and drank half of it. "You're going to do the drawing room thing," he said without particular enthusiasm. It was the tone of a man who has witnessed a conjuring act often enough to find it impressive and exasperating in equal measure. "I am going to do," said Poirot mildly, "the thing that is necessary. There is one question to which I do not yet have an answer. Everything else I have. But that one question is, I think, the question that matters most of all." The study at 10 o'clock contained 5 people arranged with the self-conscious unease of those who have been told they are not under suspicion and have not believed it. Richard stood near the fireplace, as people who are uncertain where to position themselves often gravitate toward fireplaces, seeking the comfort of a defined edge. Clara sat in the chair by the desk with her hands in her lap and her face arranged in the expression of someone prepared for difficult news. Marsh occupied the window seat with his arms folded, watching the room rather than any person in it. Japp stood near the door with Sergeant Howell. Eliza Ward had been asked to attend and stood slightly apart from the others near the bookcase, as though proximity to the shelves offered some marginal reassurance. Harbury was the last to enter. He came without being fetched, which Poirot noted. He took his place without being directed, which Poirot noted also. He did not look at the desk. On the desk, the velvet envelope lay precisely where it had lain on the morning of Lady Helena's death. Dark against the blotter, sealed, patient. Poirot stood before the fireplace and was quiet for a moment. He had the gift, which is rarer than commonly supposed, of making a room attend to him without demanding its attention. He simply waited, and the room, by degrees, came to him. "I wish to begin," he said, "not with the crime before us, but with a question of a very simple kind. The morning Lady Helena was found, who first discovered the body?" Clara's chin came up. "I did. I have said so from the beginning." "Yes," said Poirot, "you have." He looked around the room with the unhurried attention of a man reading a document in which he already knows the significant word. "And the rest of you, when did you first come to this room that morning?" Richard said he had come at Clara's scream. Marsh confirmed the same. Eliza, from the doorway, nodded in agreement. Poirot turned at last to Harbury. Harbury said nothing for the span of 3 measured seconds. In the architecture of a room that has gone very still, 3 seconds are a considerable thing. His eyes moved, involuntarily and briefly, to the velvet envelope on the desk. Not as a man seeing something unexpected, but as a man seeing something he had believed removed from the equation, unexpectedly returned to it. It was the smallest of movements. A flicker, a reflex suppressed a fraction of a second too late. But it was enough. "You were here before Clara," said Poirot quietly. "At 11 o'clock the previous night. You have told me so yourself." He addressed the room, not the man. "Dr. Harbury entered this study and found Lady Helena dead. He did not raise the alarm. He staged what we have all been examining as evidence. The velvet letter, written in his hand on his stationery, placed before a body he had arranged. The handkerchief, not placed by him as it happens, but serving his purpose nonetheless, by drawing attention to a man he knew could not be the answer." The room received this in a silence of several different textures. Richard's face had gone through 3 expressions in rapid succession. Clara's had gone through none, which was, Poirot thought, its own kind of expression. "But you said," said Marsh carefully from the window seat, "that he staged what we found, not that he created the death itself." "Précisément," said Poirot. "Lady Helena Velmont was not killed by Dr. Harbury 2 nights ago." He paused, and in the pause the room rearranged itself around the next sentence. "She was killed by the same agency that has killed many people who have encountered truths that someone powerful wished to remain buried. He gave it to them then, not all at once, but assembled piece by piece in the manner of a man demonstrating how a mechanism works, by showing each component in sequence before setting the whole in motion. Edmund's discovery, the experimentation, the sealed record, the career preserved at the cost of 3 patients' suffering and 1 boy's life. The decade of silence during which Harbury had rebuilt his practice on the foundation of what he had escaped. And Helena's investigation. 2 years of systematic, meticulous gathering. The letters she had unearthed. The sealed letter she had placed with Marsh against the possibility that she did not survive to use what she had found. The anonymous letters she had herself received, which were not warnings from outside, but the work of someone inside this house who knew she was close and was, in the particular register of the desperate, attempting to frighten her into abandoning the search. She was not frightened, Poirot said. She was resolved, which is why, in the end, the anonymous letters were insufficient, and a more final measure was required. Harbury had not moved throughout. He sat with his hands on his knees and his eyes on a point in the middle distance that appeared to contain something only he could see. His face was not the face of a man surprised by what he was hearing. It was the face of a man arriving at last, at a destination he has long known was there. The question I told Japp I could not yet answer, Poirot continued, his voice quieter now, was this: how was the death accomplished? Lady Helena was found without mark of violence. The window was undisturbed. The door was locked from the inside. He allowed a pause. The locked door puzzled me for some time. It did not, ultimately, withstand scrutiny. The lock on this study door can be engaged from the outside with the blade of a penknife, if one knows the mechanism. I know this because Eliza Ward, who is thorough in the performance of her duties, mentioned to me that the lock had once jammed and had been opened by the previous housemaid in precisely this manner. He looked at Harbury. You administered something, he said. A substance suited to your particular expertise. Something that would not announce itself in the first examination of a body, in a county where the examining physician has no reason to look beyond the apparent. He paused. The post-mortem will look further. Japp has ensured that. Harbury's eyes came to him at last, and there was in them something that Poirot would think about afterwards. Not for its horror, but for its peculiar quality of recognition. As though, in being seen entirely, the man had been granted something he had not known he required. The post-mortem will find what you expect it to find, Harbury said. His voice was level, composed even. I do not intend to dispute it. Japp moved then quietly toward the desk. The room breathed. Poirot turned and looked at the velvet envelope on the blotter, dark, sealed, the paper of it drinking the morning light. It had been, from the beginning, a prop in someone else's story. A story constructed to close a chapter that had, in fact, been demanding its ending for 10 years. It had closed it, only not in the manner its author had intended. Chapter 9. All masks removed. Japp took Harbury into the hall. He did it with the quiet, practiced economy of a man who has performed this particular function many times, and has learned that it requires neither drama nor explanation. That the moment itself carries sufficient weight, and that anything added to it is surplus. Sergeant Howell followed. The door to the study closed. The 4 people remaining in the room did not look at one another immediately. They looked at the door or the floor or the middle distance with the collective expression of those who have witnessed something they will spend some time absorbing. Then Richard Velmont sat down, abruptly and without ceremony, in the nearest chair, as though his legs had decided independently that they had discharged their obligations for the morning. He killed her, Richard said. Not as an accusation. The time for accusation had passed. It was rather the particular inflection of a man testing a sentence to see whether it holds. He killed her, Poirot confirmed. He had not moved from before the fireplace. And, before her, your cousin. Though that death will present the law with complications that Helena's will not. Edmund. Richard said the name with the difficulty of someone lifting an object that has been left in one position for so long it has become part of the floor. All this time, said Poirot. A silence. It was not an uncomfortable silence, or rather, it was uncomfortable in a way that was earned and therefore appropriate. The discomfort of people in the presence of something true. Marsh spoke from the window seat where he had remained throughout. The letters, the ones Helena left with me. He had the look of a man performing a mental audit in real time. She knew then she had known for some time. She had suspected for years and known for 2, Poirot said. The difference between the 2 states occupied her considerably. It is one thing to carry a conviction. It is another to have the means of demonstrating it to people who require demonstration. He moved to the desk and looked at the velvet envelope without touching it. She assembled what she needed. She came here with the intention of a reckoning. She did not, I think, anticipate how close Harbury was watching. She invited him herself, Clara said. Her voice was even, but there was something beneath the evenness. Not grief, exactly, or not only. She told me she wanted everyone present. I thought at the time it was for the biography, something Julian needed. I did not ask. You were protecting her, Poirot said gently, by not asking, by ensuring that what she did not tell you, you could not inadvertently disclose. He looked at Clara directly. She chose well in her confederates. You held more than you knew, mademoiselle, and held it without being asked to. Clara received this without visible response. But something in the set of her jaw altered by a fraction. He told them then, in the order it required to be told, the full construction of what had taken place across 10 years and 2 nights. He told it without sensationalism and without haste, in the manner that a good accountant presents a reckoning, methodically, with each figure in its proper column, so that the total, when it arrives, is not a surprise, but an inevitability. He told them about the experimentation, the unauthorized, trials, the 3 patients harmed, the sealed record that had preserved Harbury's career while burying the evidence of what it had cost. He told them about Edmund's discovery and the folder of copied records and the ultimatum delivered with the moral certainty of a 15-year-old who has not yet learned that the world does not always respond to righteousness with capitulation. He told them about the embankment. Richard's face, as he heard this, underwent a series of changes that Poirot observed and did not comment upon. The final change was the least expected. It was not anger, but something quieter and more complicated. The expression of a man who has, for 10 years, blamed himself for not stopping something he could not have known was happening, and is now in the process of revising the ledger. It did not entirely console him, but it shifted the weight. He was running from the house, Richard said. From Harbury. From Harbury, Poirot confirmed. Your cousin was not in distress at some ambient trouble. He was running from a specific and immediate danger. What you saw at the garden gate was the last sighting before the wood. Richard looked at his hands for a long time. Then he looked at the fireplace, and then at the window, and then at nothing in particular. "I should have gone after him," he said. "You could not have known," said Poirot. "No." A pause. "But I have spent 10 years being glad that he was gone, and not examining why I was glad, and that is not something I can put entirely outside myself, whatever the law might say about it." It was, Poirot considered, the most honest thing Richard Velmont had said in the several days of their acquaintance. He said nothing in reply, because there was nothing to say that would have been more useful than the silence of someone who had heard it. Marsh unfolded his arms and stood. He crossed to the desk and looked at the velvet envelope with an expression of weary assessment. "The biography," he said. "Obviously it cannot proceed in the form I had anticipated." "Non," said Poirot, "but it may proceed in a better one. Lady Helena's investigation, the 2 years of work, the archives, the correspondence, all of this exists. Clara knows where it is. It is in its own right a document of considerable significance." He looked at Marsh. "The story of a woman who refused for a decade to accept a convenient lie, who built her case alone and nearly completed it. That is, I think, a subject worthy of a biographer's attention." Marsh was quiet for a moment. He had the look of a man receiving an idea he intends to examine when he is alone and under less pressure. "Her reputation," he said. "The novels, the question of Clara's, amendments to the manuscripts." Clara looked up sharply. Poirot raised one small, precise hand. "The question of the manuscripts," he said, "is a matter between those who are living and concerns those who are gone, only insofar as their wishes can be determined." Lady Helena was aware of what Clara had done. She was not, I think, displeased by it. A woman who values competence over intimacy tends to approve of competence even when it exceeds its brief. He regarded Clara with the mild directness of a man delivering a judgment he has considered carefully. What was done in necessity, with skill, in service of work that mattered? This is not the same as what was done by a man who considered that his own judgment entitled him to the lives of others. The two must not be measured on the same scale. Clara said nothing, but she looked, for the first time since the morning of the discovery, as though she had taken a full breath. Eliza Ward had not spoken throughout. She stood still by the bookcase with her arms at her sides, and the expression of someone who has been present at something important and is not yet certain what to do with having been present at it. Poirot came to stand near her, not close, at a comfortable remove. He spoke quietly, so that the words were between the two of them. "What you saw in the wood," he said, "you will need to give a formal account of it, to Japp, in time, possibly in a court, if the matter of Edmund's death can be brought within the law's reach." He paused. "I will not pretend that this is without difficulty. It will require you to repeat in public something you have held privately for 10 years. It will require of you a kind of courage that is different from the courage of action, and in some ways more exacting." Eliza looked at the bookcase, at the spines of Lady Helena's novels, 14 of them standing in their quiet, authoritative row. "I came here," she said at last, "because I could not keep it any more, because every year it was heavier, not lighter, because I thought, if I could only be near the truth of it, something would—" She stopped. "Resolve itself," said Poirot. "Yes. And has it?" She considered this for a moment with the seriousness it deserved. "Not resolved," she said. "But it is no longer only mine. That is different." She turned and looked at him directly, and there was in her expression something that had not been there on the morning of his arrival. A quality of presence, of being entirely in the room she was standing in rather than divided between it and the wood of 10 years ago. "I will tell it," she said. "I will tell all of it." "Bien," said Poirot simply. The room had emptied by degrees. Richard to the library, Marsh to his room with the particular purposeful energy of a man who has found his subject, Clara to the small cabinet where Lady Helena's papers were held, to begin the inventory that grief and duty required in equal measure. Poirot stood alone in the study for a few minutes. He looked at the desk and its velvet envelope. He looked at the window and the lake beyond it, silver and still under the high autumn sky. He looked at the shelf of manuscripts, 14 novels, each one a precise and intricate architecture of motive, method, and revelation, and thought about the woman who had written them. She had understood, he reflected, why people do terrible things. She had spent a lifetime demonstrating that understanding in print, with compassion but without excuse. And then she had discovered that understanding was not sufficient, that comprehension, however generous, does not by itself constitute justice. She had gone about obtaining justice in the manner available to her, methodically, patiently, and alone. She had not quite finished. He had finished it for her. Whether that was satisfaction or sorrow, Poirot could not, at this particular moment, entirely determine. He suspected it was both, as most endings are, and that the two would take some time to separate themselves into their respective proportions. Outside, a crow called once from the stone embankment, and was silent. He straightened a small object on the desk, a paperweight, an amber globe that caught the light, and held it, and left the study, closing the door behind him with the quiet care of someone leaving a room where something important has come to rest. Chapter 10. After the storm. The police motor car had been gone an hour when Poirot noticed that Harbury was no longer in the house. He had been in it. After Japp had taken his initial statement in the hall, Harbury had been told that he was not to leave the premises. A request made in the particular register that falls between instruction and formality, the register that relies on the subject's own understanding of what departure would signify. Japp had gone to the village to make arrangements and to telephone. Sergeant Howell had remained, and somewhere in the interval between Howell's attention and the ordinary business of the house, Harbury had walked out through the garden door and down toward the lake. Howell came to Poirot at 11:30 with the expression of a man who has lost something and knows that the losing of it will require explanation. "He's gone down to the water, sir. I've looked from the upper window. He's standing at the embankment, the south end near the willow." Poirot looked at the sergeant for a moment. Then he looked out of the window at the lake, which was visible from where he stood. Flat, silver, entirely still. The willows at its far margin trailing their bare branches in the water, with the patience of things that have no appointments to keep. "Yes," said Poirot. "I see. Should I fetch him back, sir?" Poirot was quiet for the length of several measured breaths. The question was not a simple one, and Sergeant Howell, to his credit, seemed to understand that it was not, and waited. "Go and telephone Inspector Japp," Poirot said at last. "Tell him what you have told me. Tell him I am here." He paused. "Tell him I am watching." Howell went. Poirot remained at the window and watched the figure at the embankment's edge, very small against the water and the pale sky, standing with the stillness of a man who has set something down, and is deciding what to do with the unaccustomed lightness that results. The figure did not return. Japp came back within the half hour, and it was Japp who went down to the embankment with Howell, and Japp's face when he came back to the house told Poirot what the lake had already told him. They sat together in the drawing room, Japp and Poirot, with the fire that Eliza had thought to light burning reasonably well, and were quiet for a time. "You knew," Japp said eventually. It was not an accusation. It was the statement of a man who has assembled a small number of facts and found that they point in only one direction. "I knew the sheet of paper on his writing table was not a letter," said Poirot. "It was face down because it was finished. A man does not leave unfinished business face down. He leaves it visible so that it reminds him." He looked at the fire. "A man who places something face down has done with it." "And you sent Howell to telephone me instead of fetch him in." "I sent Howell," Poirot said carefully, "to inform you of the situation, so that the decision of what to do might be made by the person whose authority it was to make it." He turned from the fire to look at Japp directly. "I made no decision. I watched, I reported." Japp considered this for some time with the thoroughness of a man who knows he is being offered an account of events that is technically accurate and morally complex, and has not yet determined how he feels about the combination. Then he reached for the cup of tea that had been left for him and drank half of it. "The law," he said, "would have had a difficult time of it anyway. Edmund's death, what you described, what the girl saw. It's not nothing, but it's not straightforward either, and a good advocate would have found the seams." "Yes," said Poirot, "he would have." "I'm not saying it's right," Japp said. "I want that noted." "It is noted, my friend." The fire settled. Outside, the beeches stood in the late morning air, stripped nearly bare now, their upper branches making the fine, intricate pattern against the sky that bare branches make, and that always suggests to those inclined to see it the illustration of something vast and unresolvable. Richard Velmont came to find Poirot that afternoon. He did not want anything in particular, which is sometimes the most honest reason a person can have for seeking someone's company. He sat in the chair by the fire and looked at it for a while, and then said, without turning, "I've been thinking about Edmund." "That is perhaps overdue," said Poirot without severity. "I was 24, Richard said, when he disappeared. I spent a week, perhaps a fortnight, hoping the body would not be found, because if it was not found there would not be an inquest, and if there was not an inquest there would not be testimony, and if there was not testimony I would not have to explain that I had seen him running and had not followed." He stopped. "I have never said that to anyone." "No. Helena guessed, I think, not the specifics. But she knew I was not telling everything. She never asked me directly. I used to wonder whether she was protecting me or punishing me with the not asking." He turned the empty glass in his hand. "I wonder now whether she was simply waiting until she had what she needed and my piece of it no longer mattered." "Your piece of it," Poirot said, "was not in the end incriminating. You saw a boy running. You did not know from what. You made a choice that you have spent 10 years regretting. But the choice was to do nothing, and the consequences of it were not Edmund's death." He paused. "The man responsible for Edmund's death has gone to his account. Whether by choice or by accumulated weight is a question that cannot be neatly answered. What can be answered is that you bear a different order of responsibility, Richard. Lighter, not weightless. Richard was quiet for a moment. Not weightless, he repeated. No. He set the glass down. I'm going to clear the debts myself. Sell the London flat. Helena's estate, whatever I inherit, I intend to use a portion of it to establish something in Edmund's name. A scholarship, perhaps, or a medical research fund. Something that cannot be associated with Harbury. He looked up. Do you think that is the right sort of thing? Poirot considered the question with the seriousness it was offered. I think, he said, that it is a beginning. Beginnings are what is available to us. The rest follows from how we manage them. He found Eliza in the kitchen garden again in the late afternoon, though there was nothing now that required cutting. She was simply standing among the lavender rows with her hands in the pockets of her coat looking at the wall, and she did not seem embarrassed to be found standing and looking at a wall, which Poirot thought well of her. You will leave Velmont House, he said. It was not a question. I expect so. There'll be solicitors and arrangements, and then, eventually, whatever the estate becomes. She looked at the lavender. It won't be what it was. Places aren't after. No, Poirot agreed. They carry what happened in them. It becomes part of the texture of the walls and the smell of the rooms. A house that has held a long secret is a different house once the secret is gone. Sometimes quieter. Sometimes, I think, relieved. Eliza turned to look at him with the direct, undecorated attention she had given him in the wood. Are you relieved, she asked, when you finish these things? It was not the sort of question Poirot was often asked, and he gave it the consideration it deserved. There is, he said, a satisfaction in the completing of a thing, in the restoration of order where disorder has prevailed. I do not apologize for that satisfaction. It is not a comfortable world in which such work is unnecessary. He paused. But relieved? No, I think not entirely. There is always what might have been otherwise, the moment before the lie was first told, when a different choice was still available. That moment is always present somewhere in the work, and one cannot look at it without some feeling that is not quite satisfaction. Eliza nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something she had already half known. He was a good boy, she said. Edmund, I did not know him, but the way he ran, there was something in it. Purpose. He was frightened, but he hadn't stopped. He was still going somewhere. He was going, Poirot said gently, to do the right thing. That is worth remembering. She looked at the lavender for a moment longer. Then she went inside, and Poirot stood alone in the kitchen garden in the failing light, with the smell of damp earth and the last of the season's herbs around him, and thought about a boy running through a dark wood toward a purpose he never reached. He departed Velmont House at first light. The motor car came at 6 o'clock, and he was ready for it. His luggage in the hall, his coat precisely buttoned, his hat at the angle he preferred. The house was not yet fully awake. The lake, beyond the garden and the stone embankment, lay in the pre-dawn stillness as it had lain at every hour of his visit, patient, flat, utterly without expression. He stood on the gravel for a moment before getting in. The beeches were dark against a sky that was only beginning, very tentatively, to consider the idea of light. The house behind him was large and still and old, and it wore its history now differently, Poirot thought, not heavily as it had when he arrived, but as one wears a thing after the worst of its weight has been taken from it. Lighter, not light, lighter. Through the drawing-room window he could see, by the glow of a lamp, someone had left burning the long table with its chairs. 6 chairs. 1 empty. He looked at the empty chair for a moment, and then at the 5 that were not empty, and thought about the people who had sat in them. The woman who had spent a decade quietly assembling what she needed to tell the truth. The man who had spent the same decade teaching himself that silence was sustainable. The nephew learning at last that guilt and culpability are different instruments in the same orchestra. The secretary whose competence had been, at once, her armour and her offering. The girl who had come to a house full of secrets carrying one of her own and left it without it. And the critic who had kept a sealed letter for 18 months because a biographer's instinct for preservation is, in the end, a form of faith. Faith that what is true will eventually require telling, and that someone will be there to tell it. They had each, in their different registers, been waiting for this. The driver opened the door. Poirot got in, settled his coat, and did not look back at the house as the motorcar moved down the drive. He had found, over many years, that looking back at houses was not useful. They remained what they were. It was only the people in them and the truths finally given air that changed. The beeches moved overhead as the car passed beneath them, their bare branches tracing their patient hieroglyphics against the early sky. The lake was visible for a moment through the trees, silver and still, holding what it held as it had always held it. Then the road curved and the trees closed, and Velmont House was gone. Poirot folded his hands in his lap, closed his eyes, and allowed the little grey cells their well-earned rest. Outside, the autumn morning continued its quiet business of becoming day.